All right, we are live, Dr. Reiff. If you want to introduce yourself, we can go ahead and get started.
I will. Thank you so much, and welcome back, everyone, to the third and final installment of Participation in Clinical Trials, a co-production of Lupus LA and Parexel International. I'm Andreas Reiff, the Senior Vice President for Immunology and Inflammation here at Parexel. And today we will have a question and answer session that followed the two prior sessions that we had on participation in clinical trials and what it takes. I appreciate that all of you submitted a lot of questions, very good questions. And with the help of Brianna from Lupus LA, we will go through all of these questions today. And hopefully by the end of the session, we will also have some time for additional questions that may come in during this live stream. So Brianna, take it away.
Thank you so much. The first question that we have for you is, where do clinical trials typically take place? Do you have to go to the hospital?
That's an excellent question. So as you may remember, in some of the prior sessions, I talked a little bit about where clinical trials take place. Some of these clinical trials are usually, well, they can be done in many different locations. They can be done in a hospital setting, obviously. That's where most of the clinical trials take place, or in your doctor's office. So that may not necessarily need to be a hospital. So a private rheumatology office, for example. And then lastly, your home. So we talked a little bit during my presentation about decentralized clinical trials. And what that means is that some of the study visits that are part of the study trial can be conducted from your living room at home. So you can be, in that case, you can be connected to your doctor via a screen, a telehealth visit. Sometimes that may not even be necessary. A nurse may come to your home. They may draw some blood from you. They may ask some questions from you, or you may be asked to enter some answers to questions in a tablet or in your private phone. So these are the three common locations for a study visit, either the hospital, your doctor's office, or a research center, a local research center, and or your home, your living room at home.
Makes sense. How often do you usually have to go to the study site, or how often would someone need to come to the hospital or the clinic typically in frequency?
This is also a very important question because, as we talked about before, a lot of you have to travel to these study sites, and that can become quite burdensome. Considering LA traffic, I know that it can take hours sometimes to get to your doctor's office or to the hospital. And then with everything being involved, it can become very time consuming. So in general, we are trying to alleviate that burden from patients like you during the study visits or during the study as a whole. But unfortunately, these visit frequency vary from study to study. And it depends a little bit on what the medication is that is being examined. If the study is about a new medication that has never been tested for diseases like lupus, we want to make sure that you're really safe and that we assess you for all the outcomes that we are measuring during a clinical trial. So study visits can occur quite frequently, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly. If a study medication is already approved and the study is about a natural history study, for example, you may only need to come into the study site every 6 months. So it depends a little bit on the type of study and the medication that is being studied. A little bit less frequency maybe for already approved medications or older medications, and a little bit more frequently for new medications.
Thank you. What kind of treatments, tests, scans, and other procedures will the patient have to experience during the clinical trial? And how will these tests and procedures be different from the ones that they are receiving in standard treatment?
Yes. So generally, in order to make these clinical trials safe for you, what we do is we add the medication. Sorry for that.
No worries.
You add these medications to the standard of care. Standard of care means you can continue your medication that you are on, and we add the study medication to these medications. So what does that mean for all the tests that you have? Well, we will typically during a clinical trial continue to monitor you for all the side effects of the medication that you're already taking, and or of course this potential study side effects of the study medication that you're currently taking. So unlike your routine visits that you may have with your rheumatologists or your internist at home, the tests associated with the study can be a little bit more extensive, a little bit more broad. We may draw some extra vials of blood just to test that you are safe. Again, we may actually draw some additional vials of blood to study how the medication exactly works in your body, how it distributes in your body. And in terms of additional medications like imaging, for example, there might be a little bit more frequent imaging that you would otherwise receive. So let's say if you have arthritis as part of your lupus and your rheumatologist conducts a X-ray survey, let's say once a year, you may have to do this a little bit more frequently during a study, because if the study medication is geared towards arthritis and lupus patients, we will have to do maybe an X-ray survey every 6 months instead of every 12 months. Again, it depends from study to study, but the testing associated with studies tend to be a little bit more extensive and maybe a little bit more frequent than what you usually have as part of your routine care.
Thank you. We had someone ask, how long will I be in the trial? How long do clinical trials usually last? Maybe you can give us an example of.
Yeah. So some of you that participated in the first 2 sessions may remember that I showed a slide of the different types of clinical trials, from phase 1, which is the earliest phase, to phase 4, which is the latest phase of a clinical study. So phase 1 studies and phase 2 studies are the early part of the clinical development, the early part of the studies. They are usually relatively short, on average between 6 to 12 months, sometimes up to 2 years. That's about the most. The phase 3 studies, which are the pivotal trials, they can last a little bit longer, 1 to 2 years, sometimes 3 years. And then the phase 4 studies, which are those studies that typically occur once a medication has already been approved, and we want to see how it works long term. These studies can take 5 years, sometimes even 10 years.
Wow. How do the doctors know if the treatment is working?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, especially when it comes to diseases like lupus. So, and that's, by the way, folks, why a lot of doctors don't want to necessarily do these clinical studies in lupus, because they are very, very involved when it comes to figuring out if a medication works or not. So before I answer this, just that you understand something, there has been so much drug development in systemic lupus over the last 20 years, and very few medications actually made it onto the market. And many people have wondered, why is that only so few medication actually work for lupus? And some people said, well, it's just a difficult disease and the medication didn't work. But others have said is that when we try to figure out how it works, or if it works for a patient, that tool that we use to figure this out may not be good enough to really figuring it out if it works or not. So the tools to figure out if a patient responds to a medication, specifically in lupus, are very, very complex. They take a lot of time. They take the doctors a lot of time to fill out questionnaires that are sometimes up to 18 pages long, and really checks every single organ system from head to toe, asks questions about how is this, is this organ system involved? Yes or no? Is this organ system that was involved before now better, the same, or worse? And so all of these different questions have to be answered in order to assess what we call the efficacy, meaning if a medication works or not, before we even close a trial and submit it to the regulatory agencies. So for you, of course, as a patient, and that is where the tricky part comes in. You may be in a study and it just so happens that your lupus, decides that I'm not that active right now, as you know, your lupus can go up and it can go down. So if your lupus is coincidentally better during the time when you are in a clinical study, you may say to the doctor, oh, I feel so much better. Now, that may not have anything to do with the fact that you are taking the study medication. It may just have something to do with the fact that your lupus just got better by itself. So that's why these tools are very tricky, and they really need to be very detailed in order to really figure out, is this lupus just generally getting better, or is it really the medication making that difference? So apologize for the lengthy answer, but this is a very difficult topic in lupus research particularly.
Not at all. We're happy to hear about it in its entirety. Speaking of results, we had another person ask, how will I be told about the results at the conclusion of the study?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Brianna?
Yeah, how will I be told about the results?
Okay. Yes. So once again, when we talk about these different types of studies that I just brought up, it is important to understand that many of them are conducted in what we call a placebo-controlled trial. Placebo-controlled trial means that some of the patients that enroll into the study will receive active study medications, and other patients will receive something that looks like an active medication but does not contain any active ingredient. And that's what we call a placebo. In order not to bias people in terms of telling us how they feel or how much better they feel, it is important that we neither the doctors nor the patient actually knows if they received an inactive ingredient medication, a placebo. Okay, so that's what we call double-blind. Double-blind means is you don't know if you take an active medication because, again, your lupus may just be better, and then you can take a sugar pill and you still feel better, or the doctor does not know if you get an active medication, so they cannot say, oh, well, I know you take an active medication, you must be so much better, so he can bias you as a patient in feeling improved. So again, sorry, long answer to your question, but generally we do not disclose any study results to the patients during the study conduct. Once you are out of the study later on, the results of the study will be published, typically published, and you can look at the results of all the patients that participated in the trial, but you will not be able to find yourself as an individual person in that study where we say, oh, this person, did better or did worse. So we do not disclose that.
What is the typical timeline between the close of a study and the publishing of the study results?
Yeah, that takes, on average, it varies, but it takes usually about 6 months. So during the trial, what we usually do is we publish intermittent results, not the final results, but let's say, what do we see after 6 months of the study or after a year of the study? So these are the results that are typically presented in abstract format at the big medical meetings. So the doctors can discuss that and already get an idea if this medication works or not. But then at the end of the study, within 6 months or so to latest a year, the results are being published in medical journals.
Okay. Another question that we received is, who can I speak to about questions I have during and after the trial?
Yes. So I would say I would take this a step further. Questions before you start the trial, during the trial, and after the trial. So before you enroll to the trial, definitely, as I mentioned also in my presentation, talk to your study doctor, the study nurse, the study personnel that's involved in this clinical trial. Again, talk to your friends and family. If you're unsure about participating in clinical trials, make sure this is the right decision for you. The same is absolutely true for any question that may happen during the study. By the way, this is a two-way street. During the clinical trial, the study personnel that is in charge of the clinical trial will have to inform you if there have been any side effects in other patients that are on this trial. So let's say we had an unusual rate of a very rare infection or something, even though it did not affect you personally. The study personnel typically has to inform you about any unusual or high frequency event and make sure that you still are willing to continue, even though, again, this side effect may not have affected you. And then after the clinical trial, that is also very important. Typically, what we see in standard clinical trials, there is either what we call an open label extension, so people can stay on this medication for a longer period of time if they choose to, and it works for them. So they're going to be monitored mainly for safety and also for how it works, efficacy. Or the trial ends, let's say, after 12 months, but you're still going to be in the study for another 3 to 6 months. Even though you're not receiving active medications anymore, we still keep you on the trial to monitor safety or anything else that may happen. Once you completely discontinue the trial and the medication is out of your system, out of your body, you will be back with your rheumatologist who will monitor you for any eventual long-term consequences.
We actually had a question about that, about care during the trial. Someone asked, who will be in charge of my care during the trial? Do I stay with my normal rheumatologist, or can I also be seen by the study doctors for questions?
Yes, absolutely. So keep in mind, and I mentioned that during the presentations before, that not every rheumatologist is involved in clinical studies. So if you are interested in any particular clinical trial that is not conducted in your rheumatologist's office, but let's say by the hospital in the next city or in the major medical center around the corner, the physician that works out of this large medical center would take over your care during the clinical study. Now, your rheumatologist may still decide to monitor you during the conduct of the clinical trial as a safety precaution, but none of this information that would go in this clinical study, in this evaluation would be part of the record of the clinical study. So that would be separate.
Okay. What happens if I experience side effects during the trial?
Yeah, they depend. Everybody, and as you know, as a lupus patient, you have experienced this every single day. You do experience side effects either of your disease or of the medication you take. Now, obviously, it depends a little bit of how severe the side effect is and how serious it impacts you. Let's say that you have a cold or an infection during the clinical study. The study doctor will either advise you to take a medication to treat that side effect. Let's say if an infection, you take an antibiotic or an antiviral medication. If it's more serious, then you would have to be hospitalized, and you would be admitted to a local hospital for further care. In such circumstances, what typically happens is that the cost for the hospitalization would be covered by the study. If it's evident that a medication or study medication side effect was the culprit of that side effect, so the study would cover all these costs and everything that goes with it. Or you may have a side effect or a repeat side effect where your study doctor would advise you to stop the medication altogether and you are released from the clinical study.
Okay, interesting. We had a question. I'm not sure if this is something you can answer, but somebody asked, how do the possible risks and benefits of trials usually compare to those of the standard treatments for lupus?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The answer is we don't know. That's exactly why we are doing these clinical studies, right? Now, having said that, not all the medications that are going into lupus are necessarily brand new medications that nobody ever else has experienced or tried. So it is very possible that a medication, let's say, that has already been approved for rheumatoid arthritis or for another autoimmune disease is now being tried in lupus. In such a scenario, the side effects are typically very similar, and we can give you a list of potential side effects that we know happen in other diseases, but there might be new ones that are specific for patients in lupus that have not been described before. And in such a case, we wouldn't know that, and that's why we collect all these extensive data to make sure that we know all of these answers to that.
Thank you, Dr. Reiff. We had someone ask, what costs do I have to pay if I take part in the trial? I think you covered some of this in your previous presentation, but they specifically asked, will my health insurance cover the trial?
Yeah, neither one, because participation in clinical trials is free. It is typically paid by the sponsor, by the company that develops the product. So you don't have to incur any cost. In fact, the cost that you incur, let's say, driving to the study visits, waiting in the waiting room, or waiting in the hospital until you have done all of your tests, and you have to have lunch in between, or you eat something, is also typically covered by the study cost. So you should not incur any additional cost participating in this trial. Meal vouchers, transportation costs, and all the medical costs that are involved in the conduct of the clinical trials are provided to you for free.
Great. The next question we got was, how will the clinical trial affect my daily life?
In general, I would say, again, it's our intention to really make clinical trials as easy on you as possible. Again, that includes the burden to come to the visits, as we have discussed. It should not really impact your daily quality of life. As you all know, the way we treat lupus nowadays has become, much more, how should I say, technical, almost much more sophisticated. The medications that we are now using are often no longer given once a day, but rather maybe once a month through an infusion, or every other week through an injection into the skin. So this kind of stuff. So in other words, unless you would experience any unusual side effects associated with this medication, it should not impact your life at all. Now, what we sometimes ask during clinical trials, not all, is to keep a diary. And a diary helps us often to really give us a real life sort of insight on how quick a medication works and how effective it really is. Once again, as I explained earlier, we have these tools that measure your quality of life, your function, how functional you are, what you can do in daily life. These are the tools that we do during the study visits. But sometimes it's much more helpful to look really at the diaries. That's a little diary that you can either have in your phone, on a tablet, or simply a paper diary, where you write in every single day, how you feel. All the symptoms. I feel crappy. I feel better. My pain is gone. I noticed for the first time that I no longer have X or Y. So these kind of things give us very important insight on the dynamic of a medication and how it actually works in real life, not just that one single spot assessment that we do during a study visit every month or so.
Thank you. Another patient asked, will I have checkups after the trial to see how it affected me once the trial concludes?
So as I mentioned earlier, typically the trials, the study medication ends and patients stay in the trial for a little longer after the last dose of medication has been given. Most of these medications that we use today wash out of the system very quickly. So if you stop taking them, they are usually out of the system within a few weeks. In rare cases, it may take months, like the B-cell depleting therapy. So it depends a little bit on what kind of medication you take. But generally, you will be reintegrated in the care of your rheumatologist, and you will have your regular checkups as you had before. So they should actually be sufficient to monitor your safety after you have completed a clinical study.
Great. And we did have another live question come in. Somebody asked, if I have a flare during the trial, will I be kicked out of the trial?
Yeah, very good question. And that's something very important. And I'll tell you why this is important. Flares in lupus happen all the time. We all know that. And the purpose of these newer treatments very often is not just improve your lupus, but actually preventing flares during your disease, right? So However, having said that, most of the clinical trials, what they do nowadays is they say, okay, we give you the new medication, and if it works for you, we want you to come down on your prednisone dose, for example, on your steroid dose. Let's say you do well, you reduce your steroid dose, and because you're now on less prednisone, all of a sudden you experience a flare. So what happens? In most of the clinical studies, what we allow, that's, I would say, the majority of them, not all of them, but in the majority of the clinical trials, what then happens is we treat that flare. And typically with a dose that of prednisone and maybe an escalation of other medication that you have been on before. And then we watch. If your flare can be controlled on a lower dose of prednisone again, on a higher dose than you had when the flare occurred, but still on the kind of same that you started, you are good to go and nobody will kick you out of the trial. But let's say you have a flare and we give you the prednisone and your flare cannot be controlled, and we may give you a little bit more prednisone or something, increase the dose of another medication somewhat, and the flare continues, then we usually say the medication did not work for you. And then we typically stop the study medication. Now, I say stop the study medication for a reason, because a lot of the companies that conduct these clinical trials, they don't want to kick you out of the trial. What they want you to do is stay on the trial, come back to your visit, even though you no longer take the active, or you no longer participate and get treated, but they want to find out what happens to you in the long run. In other studies, we have a so-called crossover design. What that means is, let's say you have a flare, and again, we cannot control it. Instead of being released from the study medication, you are now having the option to enroll into the long-term extension arm of the study, where everybody will get active treatment. So let's say you experience a disease flare because you ended up on the placebo, the inactive medication. And again, you flare and we can control it. So that some studies allow you to get out of that part of the study and allow you to enroll into open label extension, the long-term extension of the trial, because we know that everyone that's on that long-term extension arm will actually receive active medication. So no chance to get the inactive ingredient, the placebo. But it depends a little bit from trial to trial.
Thank you so much for explaining that, Dr. Reiff. And those are all of our live questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for sending me these wonderful questions, really smart questions. Let me just give you a couple of take-home messages. First of all, thanks for your engagement. Thanks for your interest in this topic. Lupus is a very difficult disease, and we yet have to find a cure. And on our journey to a cure, which will be a tough one, we have to find better treatment. You can become part of the team between the drug developers, the pharma industry, and us, the people who conduct these clinical studies and contribute to finding better treatments for patients like you, improving the quality of your life, and finding safer medications for all the patients that will come, and develop lupus after you. So we are here for you. Become part of the treatment team, become part of the journey, and support Lupus LA. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dr. Reiff.